Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've brewed around Golbez, Crystal Collector, a commander from the Final Fantasy set that I think has been kind of overlooked a bit. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scryfall, which includes our basic lands at 10 cents each, but as a list price, this wouldn't include costs such as shipping. So, Golbez, Crystal Collector, is a 1/4 legendary human wizard for a blue and a black, and has it so whenever an artifact you control enters the battlefield, you surveil 1. And then, at the beginning of your end step, if you control 4 or more artifacts, you return a target creature from your graveyard to your hand. And then, if you control 8 or more artifacts, each opponent loses life equal to that card's power. Which to me seemed like the makings of an interesting take on a Dimir graveyard deck, where instead of the typical reanimate to cheat a large creature from your grave onto the board, you'll instead look to consistently dump some creature with high power into the graveyard, and then return it back to your hand and drain your opponents out primarily through that. Though, we're going to need a few things to achieve this. First, we'll need some high power creatures to put into the grave, which most of these will have high mana values, and thus we'll rarely ever actually cast them. Though, we'll also only need a moderate number of these, as barring a bunch of graveyard hate, we'd be putting the most powerful card that we've come across that game back and forth between the grave and our hand, likely leaving all the others in the grave. However, to get them into the grave, we're going to want to use Golbez's first ability whenever possible, both for clearing the top of our library so that we draw things that we actually want to cast, or lands when needed, and dumping any high power creature into the yard to recover later, but we'll also want a decent selection of looting type effects, where we draw and then discard, so that we can dump away any of those large creatures that we've either wound up drawing by accident, or that we've returned from the grave in a previous turn. And of course, to make this all work, we're going to need plenty of artifacts, which we can get through ramp spells, some artifact lands, other artifacts with useful effects, but most importantly are going to be artifact token generators that can work consistently to pump out artifacts, such as on our upkeep or whenever we cast a spell of a particular type, with the goal of getting to that magic number of 8 artifacts on the field when our deck really starts to get into gear. And it's also good to note that Golbez's first ability works on all artifacts, including any artifact tokens we generate. But that's the gist of this deck. Let's start digging into the 99 of it, starting with our ramp. Starting with some generic mana rocks, we have Mind Stone, Prismatic Lens, the Iron Crag, and Fractured Power Stone, all 2-drops entering untapped and producing generic mana. Charcoal Diamond and Sky Diamond, which will produce black and blue respectively. Arcane Signet, which will tap for either of our colors. Dimir Signet, which will convert 1 mana into a blue and a black mana. And Ornithopter of Paradise, as a 0/2 flying mana dork that will tap for any color. But with that, let's move on to the high power creatures we'll look to cycle between our grave and our hand. First up is Troll of Khazad-dûm, which has the lowest power by far of all of these cards that I'm going to mention at 6, but with Swamp Cycling for 1, we can easily get it into the graveyard and ensure that we get a land drop, and we can even tutor some non-basic swamps, which we'll get into in the lands chapter. But if it's the only creature we have for some time, or we just need the lands, we'll be able to use it repeatedly for this. Colossus of Sardinia is a 9/9, Breaker of Anomalies, Leviathan, Supreme Exemplar, Colossus of Akros, and Metalwork Colossus all have 10 power, with Metalwork Colossus having a significant enough cost reduction effect that, provided we have something else that we can cycle between our grave and our hand, we may actually be able to get out for a reasonable cost. Denizen of the Deep is here with 11 power. Ancient Stone Idol is a 12/12 that, like Metalwork Colossus, could also potentially be cast for a somewhat reasonable mana cost, as it costs 1 less for each attacking creature, which is anyone's attacking creatures regardless of who's being attacked. Yokel Mortar is a 12 power creature that's definitely best to be going between our grave and our hand and not on the battlefield. And finally is Death's Shadow as a 13/13 for 1 black that we'd likely be able to get into the grave pretty easily even without looting, as it gets -X/-X, where X is our life's total. But with that, I'd like to start going over some cards that can fairly consistently put out some artifact tokens. Starting with Thopter Spy Network, making a 1/1 Thopter artifact creature token at the beginning of our upkeep, provided we already control an artifact, and whenever one or more artifact creatures we control deal combat damage to a player, we draw a card. Retrofitter Foundry can be tapped with 2 mana to make a 1/1 Servo artifact creature token, and we can pay 3 mana to untap it, of which we can also tap it and pay 1 and sack a Servo to make a 1/1 Thopter artifact creature token, or simply tap it and sack a Thopter, possibly produced from one of our other artifact token generators, to make a 4/4 Construct artifact creature token, with these latter 2 abilities not increasing the count of artifacts we control, but could give us a way to surveil some more with Golbez. Obsessive Pursuit has you lose 1 life, and then make a clue token when it enters and at the beginning of your upkeep, and if you no longer need to stockpile those artifacts for the main deck goal, when you attack you put X +1/+1 counters on a target attacking creature, with X being the number of permanents you sack that turn. Unshakable Tail has you surveil 1 when it enters and on your upkeep, and then you make a clue artifact token whenever 1 or more creature cards are put into your graveyard from your library. Efficient Construction and Psy Master Thopterus make a 1/1 Thopter artifact creature token whenever you cast an artifact spell, so a 2-for-1 deal for getting that count of 8 artifacts. And in a similar vein, Forensic Gadgeteer makes a clue token whenever you cast an artifact spell. And finally for this section is the Mechanist, Aerial Artisan, which makes a clue token whenever you cast a non-creature spell. But now let's start going over some of our looting effects. Starting with Frantic Search and Stern Lesson, the first having you draw 2, discard 2, and then untap up to 3 lands, and the latter having you draw 2 and discard 1, and then making a tapped Power Stone artifact token. Vohar, Vitalian Desecrator, Thought Courier, and Merfolk Looter are all 2-drops that we can tap to draw and then discard a card. Looter Ilkor has Shadow, so it can only block and be blocked by creatures with Shadow, and has you loot whenever it deals damage to an opponent. And Bodden Fetch is a 3-drop with Defender and Haste that can also be tapped to draw 1 and then discard 1. Rook Turret has you draw 1 and discard 1 whenever another artifact you control enters. Matzalantali, the Great Door, is an artifact that can be tapped to draw 1 and discard 1, and could also be transformed into the legendary land The Core, which taps for X mana of any one color, where X is the number of permanents in your graveyard. Not the main reason it's here, but it's nice that it can be done. And finally, Collector's Vault can be tapped with 2 mana to draw a card, discard a card, and then make a treasure token. And now I'd like to talk about a few cards that are useful, but don't perfectly slot into one of the main chapters. The first being the Underworld Cookbook, being a 1-drop artifact and discard outlet, where you can tap it to discard a card and create a food token. Swiftfoot Boots is a 2-drop artifact that gives its equipped creature hexproof and haste, a way to protect Golbez or another piece if somebody wants to target it. And Enhanced Surveillance lets you look at 2 additional cards each time you surveil, giving you more agency when you're manipulating the top deck, and getting things into your yard. But now I'd like to move on and start talking about our sources of card advantage. Starting with Ancestral Remembrance, which has you draw 3 and then discard 1. Risky Research and Dire Sight having you first surveil 2, then draw 2, and lose 2 life. Thoughtcast having you draw 2 cards, and it has affinity for artifacts. And doing the same as Thought Monitor, though it's an artifact creature with flying instead of a sorcery. Tamiyo's Logbook can be tapped with at most 5 generic and a blue to draw, but that ability costs 1 less generic to activate for each other artifact you control. Matoya, Archon Elder, lets you draw a card whenever you scry or surveil, of which you do so after you've scried or surveilled. And finally, Mystic Forge lets you look at the top card of your library at any time, cast artifact and colorless spells from the top of your library, and you can tap it and pay 1 life to exile the top card of your library. But now I'd like to move on to our interaction spells. Starting with Turn Aside, a 1-drop counterspell that counters a spell targeting a permanent we control. Of course, counterspell for 2 blue. Disruption Protocol, also countering a target spell for 2 blue, but you either have to tap an artifact you control or pay an additional 1 to cast it. Negate, countering a non-creature spell. And Stoic Rebuttal being a general counterspell for 2 blue and 1, but it costs 1 less generic to cast if you control 3 or more artifacts. Go for the Throat and Infernal Grasp, letting you destroy a creature at instant speed, the former only non-artifact creatures, and the latter targeting any creature, but you lose 2 life. While Feed the Swarm destroys a target creature or enchantment an opponent controls at sorcery speed, and you lose life equal to that permanent's mana value. Observe Stasis is an aura with flash, enchanting a creature an opponent controls, and when it enters, it removes the enchanted creature from combat, and has you then draw cards for each tap creature its controller controls. And then the enchanted creature loses all abilities and can't attack or block. Aetherize is basically a fog in blue, returning all attacking creatures to their owner's hand. And finally we have Black Sun Zenith, and Day of Black Sun. X cost sorcery wipes with the former giving each creature X and -1/-1 counters, and then getting shuffled into your library, and the latter having each creature with mana value X or less lose all abilities until the end of the turn, and then all of those creatures are destroyed. But now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's go over our land base. First up are Fetid Pools and Sunken Hollow, island swamps that we could tutor with the Troll of Khazad Doom. The former we can cycle away if we don't want to land when we get it, and the latter enters untapped if we control 2 or more basic lands. Choked Estuary entering untapped if you reveal an island or a swamp from your hand when you play it. Darkwater Catacombs converting 1 mana into a blue and a black mana. And Tainted Isle producing generic always, but it can produce blue or black if you control a swamp. Command Tower will tap for either color we could need. And Temple of Deceit will enter tapped, but at least we get to scry 1 when it enters. Mistfall Bridge is a Dimir artifact land, though it does enter tapped. Seat of the Synod is a blue producing artifact land that enters untapped. Scene of the Crime and Power Depot being generic producing artifact lands that unfortunately do enter tapped. Darksteel Citadel is an artifact land entering untapped and producing generic. along with Treasure Vault, entering untapped and producing generic, but you can also sack it with 2x mana to produce X treasure artifact tokens. Buried Ruin produces generic, and can be sacked to return a target artifact from our grave to our hand should we lose one that we didn't want to lose. And aside from those, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 12 basic islands and 12 basic swamps. And now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's go over its price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing for somewhere around $44.50 at the time of recording, which does include our basic lands at 10 cents each, but wouldn't include costs such as shipping. And before closing out this video, I'd like to mention some cards you may wish to consider if you want to use a higher budget or are upgrading the deck that I've presented. For some interaction, there's an offer you can't refuse and access denied for counterspells, while Withering Torment would give us another way to hit enchantments. Desynchronization will be close to a one-sided clear out, as the vast majority of our non-land permanents would be historic, either being legendary or artifacts. Lightning Greaves and Whisper Silk Cloak are some more artifacts that can help keep Golbez or another piece on the field. Propaganda, Dissipation Field, and No Mercy can help us keep our opponents from swinging at us, Propaganda making it cost mana to do so, Dissipation Field bouncing anything that deals damage to us back to its owner's hand, and No Mercy destroying any creature that deals damage to you. Vault of Whispers is another artifact land, basically the black version of Seat of the Synod, though it costs significantly more. And while expensive, there's Undercity Sewers as the surveil land for Dimir, a tutorable island swamp, entering tapped and having you surveil one when it enters. Insight Engine being another artifact to access draw that can start a bit slowly, but can ramp into quite a bit of draw as turns progress. April O'Neil, Human Element, Mirrodin Besieged, Tival's Judgment, Black Market Connections, and Stride Hanger Automaton are some more options for ways to get additional artifact tokens across turns to reach that magic number of 8 on the field sooner. Y'shtola Rule is one that I've gone back and forth on, as she doesn't have a particularly high power and does cost 6 mana to cast, but if you have multiple targets in your grave for Golbez's ability, having 2 end steps per turn could go a long way. And if you want to play with tutors, there's always Entomb and Buried Alive to directly get big boys out of our library and into the grave. And while I didn't include any of the effect in the budget deck to try not to water down the game plan too much, a card or two like Reanimate may be fun to add in, so you can cheat out one of your big boys onto the field, especially if you already have multiple of those in the grave already, so that you can continue to use Golbez's Drain ability even if we reanimated one. But I should close out this video, so if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. Consider dropping the video a like if you think I've earned it, and maybe drop a sub while you're down there. But regardless, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.